If you have a news feed on Twitter or Facebook or Instagram or something, I'm sure this probably crawled across it at some point over the weekend. This YouTube video of this young man from Kentucky, from a Catholic school there, who was with the rest of his schoolmates attending an anti-abortion rally in Washington, D.C., and they got into face-off with a couple of Native Americans who were there for the Indigenous Peoples March, also happening in Washington, D.C. at the same time. The video shows this young man being rather not being a nice guy, and as well as the rest of the students behind him, taunting the Indigenous people there who were chanting, and he happens to be a veteran, and all kinds of things were coming up. As you can imagine, the news got a hold of this. Probably the best account of this I found on NPR. Lots of other accounts there. Also, Twitterers spent a little time going through and finding out who this kid was to begin with, and then outing his identity as well. And then certainly the other side got involved, at least an eyewitness, a student then from this Catholic school in Kentucky, went through and posted what his perspective of all this was. Really went through and denounced everything that everybody thinks happened there, which is fascinating to me. And I'm using this as an example to go through and talk about persuasive theory when it comes to what's called dual process. And textbooks have a tendency to go through and make this a lot more difficult to understand than it is. Really, it just boils down to how the mind and the heart can be affected. And there are a couple of different theories that go through and talk about this. One is the elaboration likelihood method, and the second is the heuristic systematic model. And I'm going to wax a little heuristic with you, meaning I'm going to simplify things here a bit, because there's some long words, and then they're put together in a syntax there that, unless we really went through and dissected them, they might still remain a little vague to us. So let me talk about the elaboration likelihood method, what that means. You know what elaboration is, right? It's where we take a topic and we go to further depth, further critical analysis as to what that method might be, or what that philosophy or idea might be, right? We take it apart and we look at all those parts and see what's going on that way. The likelihood is a dichotomy. It's a scale. How likely are we to be elaborative with this? Is already what this is saying. What is the likelihood of us taking this thing apart and looking at it for what it is? And in persuasion, that's important to understand, because we are persuaded on low elaboration levels and on high elaboration levels and everything in between. And it's important as we study persuasion to figure out maybe where we might be the most vulnerable, right? Like with the story that I just showed you. I was enraged when I first saw this, okay, and because I had a little elaboration with it, and then the more I started to go through and take it apart and see what's going on, the less enraged I became, and the more befuddled and maybe upset at the whole media process I became instead of the story itself. The heuristic/systematic model is basically the same thing. Heuristic being simplified, and the systematic being, well, it's a little bit more complicated way of going through and seeing how we are persuaded. So I'm hoping that kind of gives you some idea of what I'm talking about. Let's get into the elaboration likelihood model. It exists on two different levels. One's called the peripheral route, and the other one's called, you got it, the central route. Peripheral meaning we're going around, and probably what we're going around here is reasoning and deep thought. The central route means that we're going through reasoning and deep thought to see what's happening. The peripheral route kind of avoids context, that physical, psychological, social, cultural, temporal analysis. It doesn't really get into that. It stays more surface, really, and deals more with the aesthetic, meaning what we see versus what we understand about what's going on. And typically our response within the peripheral route is short term, and that ends up in what we call a low elaboration. And some tie this directly to what we feel in the heart. Now, I'm hoping we all know here that while we might think we feel things in the heart, we actually feel them in the head. But our emotions that manifest in the center of our being, in the center of our body, okay, go through, we think they're attached to the heart. And so that's why I have this funky little heart graphic up here for you to demonstrate the peripheral route. The central route's a little different. It's 180 degrees out of phase with what I just said. It's deep, okay? It's thoughtful. It's very high elaboration going on with that. It's critical in its process. It asks questions, if that makes any sense. So let's apply this. For some of you who've had me in argumentation, there's a documentary that I worked on years ago that dealt with the explosion of an atomic bomb called Dirty Harry. And this was in the late 1950s in southern Utah. Actually, it was in southern Nevada, about 113 miles to the south of St. George. And this had quite an effect on the area there. The people in the area kind of prided themselves on what was going on as far as the Atomic Energy Commission testing nuclear weapons above ground in their backyard. And as you can imagine, as this persisted, a lot of people got sick as a result of this, got a number of different types of cancer. And these people, known as the downwinders, got together and put together a class action lawsuit to go through and sue the federal government. Their case was heard by a federal judge in Salt Lake City. He founded for the plaintiffs on this class action suit, and the United States government overturned it because they said that they were acting within the best interest of the United States, no matter how many people might be affected by cancer and so on and so forth. That's a really long story, one that I'm not going to elaborate with you any further, other than the fact that finding a link between the cancer that these people contracted, the types of cancer, and the above-ground radiation, the link doesn't exist pathologically. It's not there. And as we were trying to go through and do this documentary on this, once we discovered that we couldn't make that link, man, things kind of died on us. Then I had a student who started to take a look at maybe the types of cancers and leukemias that these people were experiencing. One of these types is a pediatric onset leukemia. And what's interesting about it is it breaks out in clusters of about a dozen kids at a time. And this happened in St. George with a number of clusters of children there. And the student of mine started to look to see where else this kind of pediatric onset leukemia might have been breaking out. And she found an outbreak in Arizona. She found one in Fallon, Nevada. She found another one in Massachusetts. And when she started to look at what all four of these places had in common, the one in Arizona, Nevada, Massachusetts, and in southern Utah, she discovered that what they didn't have in common was radioactivity. Okay, that wasn't a common denominator. What they did have in common, though, was the fact that each one of these areas mined silver. St. George had 2 silver mines, and they happened to be up in the Pine Valley Mountain area, and they both fed into the water aquifers that kept southern Utah in drinking water and in irrigation water as well. So this is, as I'm talking about this is high elaboration thinking going on, okay? As opposed to not being able to see the forest for the trees in a way. When people were starting to get cancer at this time, they were blaming it on the above ground radioactivity that was going on, where in fact, this is an aerial shot of one of the mines, where in fact the silver mining that was going on and leaching out these, leaching silver out using different very toxic elements like tungsten and arsenic and mercury, was going through and actually making the people sick. So I'm hoping I didn't complicate things here for you, but that's how the elaboration likelihood model works. It gets away from what might be the obvious and then starts to look at maybe some other details. And here with this student who went through to take a look at the common denominators of these cluster outbreaks led us to something a little bit more convincing. No, there's the variable within this. There's a study that was published here by, his name escapes me, and that's terrible because he's got 2 PhDs involved in studying radiation. And what his study indicated was that there wasn't a plausible link between the radioactivity and the cancers that people were getting in southern Utah. And that became a variable of expertise. This was an individual who was engaged in high elaboration, who was able to go through and construct an argument and reduce any kind of biasing factors, okay, to go through and present that evidence. But as you can imagine, those people who were affected in southern Utah at the time by all these carcinogens kind of defaulted to a low elaboration, that they were always right in what it was that they were doing. And not to discount or discredit what was going on, but a little careful thought was going on to maybe address the entire situation. And as they say, hindsight is always 20/20. Here we are, decades later, to be able to go through and say, oh, wait a minute, maybe it wasn't the radioactivity. And that's tough for the downwinders, because we didn't finish the documentary, because if we had, it would have taken away what little monies the federal government were giving to those individuals who were affected by what was going on in the area at the time, and we didn't want to go through and intercede that. Moderate elaboration would have just made some kind of association with the credibility of the research that was going on, and maybe to slow down the whole investigative process to see what was happening. And somehow, one of these is going to end up in some kind of self-fulfilling prophecy or some kind of self-validation, and that's something we want to resist within the study of persuasion. We need to maintain I think a healthy context as far as biasing factors might be concerned out there as we're looking at elaboration likelihood. The heuristic systematic model, like I was saying before, heuristic processing versus systematic processing. Heuristic is simple. It's very narrow, and it's very formative, cause and effect. Systematic is not. It depends on what our ability is to go through and research and see what our motivations might be. And it becomes more summative, not cause and effect necessarily, but more drawing information together to make maybe see if there were other influences involved in whatever it is that we're trying to do. The difference between this one and the elaboration likelihood model is that this one happens simultaneously. And I don't know, I'm hard pressed to endorse that whole concept of that whole idea there. That model really subsists on what we deal with in terms of automatic attitudinal responses. And if you've had me for social media or for argumentation, I've beaten you over the head with this whole concept that without deliberating, without elaborating, then we default to certain types of automatic attitudinal responses, like the intolerance of ambiguity or defensiveness or cultural conditioning or ethnocentrism or primary certitude. Which brings me to this. Many of you wrote about this in your assignment, having to do with Marwell and Smith's taxonomy of influences. And you beat me to the punch, because as soon as I saw this, I thought, man, this would be great to go through and talk about with the dual process, especially the elaboration likelihood model. And many of you were elaborative on this. In fact, all of you who use this as an artifact, you went that direction, and hats off to you, because in a way, you're able to go through and identify what it was that Gillette was trying to do. And yet, if you search this, you'll find that there were those who went the peripheral route instead, and who were offended by it, and are boycotting Gillette and not understanding the fact that men really need to be better than what men are being. So for this week, what I'm asking you to do is to go through, and if you haven't seen this clip, I'd like you to take a look at it, okay? And go to the discussion posts, the discussion area for this Canvas page, and watch the video and answer the questions that I have there that have to do with the elaboration likelihood model. I'm not going to get into the heuristic side. The elaboration likelihood model and why people responded to this the way they did. All right? All right. Thanks for watching. If you have any questions, you know where to find me.